is not enough to teach what Jesus taught. We must teach how Jesus taught. Jesus' teaching was amazing. It was mesmerizing. And in this series, we're going to look at 4 qualities of Jesus' teaching. In the book, I've got 14. And I would encourage you to read through the Gospels as we study this together and look for, in fact, you might just pause the video for a little bit and talk about what did you discover this week about teaching like Jesus. If you taught using stories last week, what stories did you use? And the fact that they will probably stick to your brain tells you something. And how did that go over? All right, this week we're going to talk about a different aspect of Jesus' teaching, and that is Proverbs. Now, you might not think of Jesus using Proverbs. We think of Proverbs, we think of the book of Proverbs. But truth be told, Jesus used this quite regularly. Let's show you one verse, John 10:6, in a number of illustrations. This is what I call a horizontal word study. And I call it that because if you can imagine a horizontal bookshelf and a number of translations of the Bible, we want to try to look through those translations horizontally and ask, how is this word translated in the various translations? And the good news is the Bible software, I use Logos software as well as Word Search. Actually, Word Search is better for doing this. But at any rate, there's probably web pages, although we've got such good software, I don't actually know about those. But at any rate, I'm going to show you 4 or 5 verses, actually the same verse in 4 or 5 translations. And I want you to observe that the same word is used in a number of different ways. And if they're all translate the same way, it's probably not anything all that interesting in a way, as far as the word study portion of it. But if a bunch of different translations translate this a bunch of different ways, you know that what happens in language is there's kind of a pool of meaning. Each word has kind of different shades of meaning. And oftentimes, there's not exactly a one-to-one correlation between the pool of meaning in one language and a word that has the exact same pool of meaning. So sometimes they'll pick something from various shades of that pool, and you see that in this verse here. John 10:6, the CEV says, Jesus told the people this story. Now, he used the word story. You might think it's the word parable, but it's not. And you'll pick up on this if you just look at it in various translations. Just by the way, might lose some of you here, but this is why I'm not a big fan of the King James only crowd. It's not because I'm critical at all of the King James. It is a great translation, arguably the single most influential piece of literature, if you want to take a translation separate from the Bible itself. But that single translation is probably the most influential piece of literature ever. At any rate, it's a great translation, but to limit yourself only to that or any other translation, you just cut yourself off from a lot of helpful information. At any rate, God's word says Jesus used this illustration as he talked to the people. The ESV says this figure of speech Jesus used with them, on and on and on. The TEV is a particularly bad translation, in my opinion, because he says Jesus told them this parable, and we learned last week what the Greek word for parable was. Do you remember what it is? Parable, more or less. And so this is a particularly bad translation because since they use the word parable, you'd think that the Greek word is parable. I already told you that's not the Greek word. And the message, Jesus told them this simple story, but they had no idea what he's talking about. So we have 5 translations, and we have 5 different renderings of this same word. Now, we want to do not only a horizontal word study, I'd like for us to look at a vertical word study. This is where we go deep. This is where we go down from the English into the Greek, and then we ask, how was this Greek word, when it was used in other places in the Greek New Testament, how was it translated by this translation in other places? That's going kind of deep, don't you think? And you might think, how in the world am I going to do that? Well, the Logos app, free Logos app, and by the way, I've spent $1 gazillion with Logos after I got my free app. But anyway, you can do it with Logos free app. I believe you can do it with a free version. You can definitely do it if you pay a little money. But at any rate, we got tools to do this. I remember they taught us how to do this in Greek class. I took every Greek class I could take in seminary. And I remember thinking at the time when they taught us how to do this, I thought, who has time for that? I will never have time for that. And I knew that even back in the day. And the good news is, in today's world, it's what a time to be alive. It's never been a better time to be a Bible teacher. We just got such great tools these days. And at any rate, with a few clicks of the mouse, in my case, in Logos software, I can show you that the underlying Greek word is paroimia, and it is translated in the NIV, used 5 different times. One term's translated figure or figure of speech, one time figure of speech, one time figuratively, One time it's translated by this phrase, I will use this kind of language. And one time it is translated proverb. And if you click on, in the Logos software, if you click on proverb, you come up with the verse where it's actually used that way. It's 2 Peter 2:22. Of them, the proverbs are true. That's that word poemia. Of them, the poemia are true. A dog returns to its vomit, and a sow that is washed goes back to wallowing in her mud. And so you get a feel for the kind of language that is used here. It's that kind of slogany, proverby kind of language. And if you get in touch with the teachings of Jesus, you discovered he will do it all, that he did it all the time. I'll give you a couple of examples. In fact, I want to get you to finish these verses for me. The first one goes like this. Jesus said, you will know the truth. Could you finish it? And the truth will set you free. Now, ask you a couple of questions about that. When is the last time you reviewed that memory verse? Do you remember when you memorized that memory verse? Probably a lot of you would say, you know what, I never did memorize that memory verse. I don't even know how I learned it. I just knew it. And that's true because of the way Jesus taught. He taught in a way that sticks to the brain. And you don't have to work on it. You don't have to try. He could have said, then you will know the truth, and it'll be really helpful that you know the truth, or so on and so on. But just that pithy kind of way he said it, it just sticks to the brain. And I'd encourage you to memorize it, but the truth is, Jesus made it real easy to memorize. Here's another one. Ask and it'll be given to you. Seek and you'll find. Knock on the door. Could you get it? Yeah, you could probably get it because the door will be open to you. And because of the way Jesus taught this, it just sticks to the brain. Going back, by the way, that last one, you shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. Those words are literally, not figuratively, but literally etched in stone in libraries and museums and in schools all across the nation. They are etched in stone by people who don't believe in Jesus, by people who don't promote Jesus, by people who don't love Jesus, by people who don't follow Jesus. And yet these pagan people take Jesus' words and etch them into stone 2,000 years later. And you know you will have taught effectively if 2,000 years from now people are literally etching your words in stone. And part of the reason why that's true is because not just what Jesus taught, but how he taught. He taught using this proverby kind of language. So when you teach, figure out what is the big idea and how can I reduce it to a memorable, slogany, kind of fresh way of saying. And Jesus did this all the time. All right, here's another one. Jesus said, you are the salt of the earth. Now he goes on to say, and if a salt loses its savor, it's good for nothing, so on and so on. And then he said, I want you to complete this verse, you're the salt of the earth, salt loses its savor, you are the light of the world. Did you get it? And I hope you did, but you can because it sticks to the brain. All right, most popular one, or common one, or famous one is what word I'm looking for, of all, Matthew 7:22. So in everything, do to others what you, did you get it? And I ask again, when's the last time you meditate on that verse? What's the last time you reviewed that verse? My guess is it's been a long time, and you didn't have to because of the way Jesus taught. He taught so effectively in this proverby kind of way that it just sticks to the brain. Let me show you a picture here, and let me ask you, what did this man say to this crowd on this day? Did you get it? I have a dream. And because of the way he said it, and he repeated it over and over and over, reduced it to a saying, and then he repeated all through that speech. It just sticks to the brain. What did this man say to this crowd on this day? Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. And probably a lot of you got it, because Kennedy said it in a pithy, proverby, sloganish kind of way that sticks to the brain. All right, next one. What do you remember that this man ever said? I did not have sexual relations with that woman. That's the one I remember. We actually visited the Clinton Museum in Little Rock a few years ago. I kept looking for that video clip because I got a bunch of video clips in that museum, but couldn't find that one for some reason. But they did stick to my brain. Rick Warren says, people don't remember sermons or speeches. They don't even remember paragraphs. What people remember are slogans. Or to communicate it in a slogan, let me quote Andy Stanley. He says, memorable is portable. If you can make it memorable, people will take it with them. If you listen to a lot of Andy, you'll notice he does this a lot. Try to reduce it down to a little slogan that people can take with them. Years ago, 40 years ago, would it be? I think that's right. 35 years ago. So I heard a sermon. I think this is actually kind of a famous sermon. A lot of preachers have preached it over the years, but I heard it myself when I was in junior high. And the sermon had a slogan. The slogan went like this: "One more night with the frogs." Just by the way, could you take a guess as to where the text of that sermon was? Story of Moses and the plagues, and there's all these frogs. And of course, if you're telling that story, you could have some fun with that. There's frogs in the bed, and frogs in the kitchen, and frogs in the stove, and frogs on the back porch and front porch, and go down the street and there's frogs, and everywhere there's frogs. And finally, Pharaoh comes to Moses and says, "I can't stand it anymore. You've got to get rid of these frogs." And Moses says, "Fine. When would you like for me to get rid of these frogs?" And Pharaoh says, "First thing tomorrow morning." Now, why did he say that? Because we like to be large and in charge. We like to be the boss. We like to make decisions. We like to be in control. And he said, "You're not going to push me around to do this right now. We're going to spend one more night with the frogs." And I remember Bill Tisdale saying, "Don't spend one more night with the frogs. Don't spend one more night with Jesus." Many of you are tempted to, each night of this revival is in a revival service. You come and you've been tempted to come to faith in Christ. But you said, "Well, maybe tomorrow, maybe tomorrow." Don't spend another night. Come to Jesus tonight. And I can remember that 40 years earlier, 40 years ago. Not because of just what he said, but because of how he said it. Don't spend one more night with the frogs. I preached a sermon a few years back, and I trying to apply my own teaching here, and I reduced it to this slogan: "I am not a grasshopper." Over and over and over in this sermon, I had them say that I am not a grasshopper. By the way, again, anyone make a guess as to what the text of that sermon was? It's that place in Kadesh Barnea where they go into the promised land. It's land flowing with milk and honey, and they say it's wonderful and so on. But they said they were giants in our sight, and so we said we were in our own sight. We were grasshoppers, and it uses that word, grasshoppers. And I said they saw themselves as grasshoppers, but they needed to see themselves that I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And I want you to see yourself that I am not a grasshopper, and I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And years later, I left that church, and people said to me, "I remember that sermon you preached. I am not a grasshopper." That just stuck in my brain. I am not a grasshopper. Does anybody know what R.G. Lee's most famous sermon was? Did you get it? Payday someday. What about Jonathan Edwards? Do you recall the most famous sermon that Jonathan Edwards ever preached? "Sinners in the hands of an angry God." He reduced it to a slogan, and it sticks to the brain. So Jesus taught using stories. He taught using proverbs. In weeks to come, next week we'll talk about the fact that he taught using a lot of questions, and he also appealed to reward. But let me invite you to stop the tape now, and did I say tape again? Stop the video now and discuss this. To discuss how you could talk a little bit about this next week's lesson, and what you're grappling with, and what the story is, and how could you reduce it down to a slogan. You might talk a little bit about what other slogans other teachers have used to stick with the brain, that have stuck to your brain. But talk with your group about how you can use slogans, proverbs, to teach effectively and to teach like Jesus taught.